Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to take a look at extending the embiggening machine that we worked on last time and turning it into something slightly different, where instead of taking one item and producing a different item when you interact with the machine, this time when you interact with the machine it's going to require multiple items and then it's going to spawn a single item from those. So it's kind of the next level up from the last one. And if you weren't sure what we did last time or joining this just now, the last time we looked at this, I essentially made a machine where you can pick up this cog and you can interact with this machine when you have the cog in your inventory, and it removes that cog from your inventory, so it completely destroys that, and it spawns a medium-sized one over here. So it gives the player kind of the impression that this machine is spawning larger and larger things, whereas actually it's just some quite simple script behind the scenes. I can now pick this medium-sized cog up. So a clear thing that might be a bit different from last time we looked at this is that we are now missing the machine that was there, the sawmill. And I've actually made it so that we're using exactly the same logic that we use in this script here. And we've attached it to this thing, this interface. And if you look at the tooltip, it says press E to craft the sawmill, so to spawn that sawmill back in the right place. It says requires saw blade. And so I've positioned some saw blades up here at the top. If I interact with that one, pick it up. And essentially that's just a template like the medium cog or the small cog, which just has the inventory item spec script attached to it, and it has the pickup spawner script attached to it. So when I interact with that, I get the saw, and then if I walk over to this machine and interact with this machine, it produces the sawmill. And it's using exactly the same logic that this was using here, where it removes one thing from your inventory and it spawns another thing on a locator. And so it's the same script, but the key difference here is that this is a template combining multiple parts. So we had the conveyor belt and we have the machine itself. And so that's quite an interesting thing. And the other thing is that it feels bigger because it's spawning it and it's not now pick upable. So it feels like quite a different sort of situation to just picking up a small cog, interacting with this machine, and then being able to pick up a medium-sized cog. And so that's kind of the power of these scripts, is you can take them and use them in different ways and make them feel very different. But what I want to do is I want to make it so that it's not just the saw that you have to pick up, but also one of these power sources from over here and these machine parts over here. So I've created templates for those items. Each of them has an inventory item spec script attached, and each of them has a pickup spawner attached so that I can pick them up. And essentially what I want to do is make it so that it requires those three things, the sawmill, the power source, and the machine parts, before you interact with this machine and it spawns this sawmill. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's take a look. If I go back into edit mode, I'm going to use advanced mode because we're doing some scripting here. And if we take a look at the item itself, so this sort of interface console here, you can see, to start with, I have essentially the same as this embiggen script, but I've called it the crafting table script. So it's the same logic, it's just got a different name because I want to do some editing to it. And I've attached that to this console, and then I've hooked up the onInteract function so that it calls the craft function in the crafting table script. Then it essentially gets hold of the player's inventory that just interacted with this, removes the item that we require from that inventory, and then plays a sound and spawns the item that we want to spawn. The item that it requires is in the accepted item, so you can see I've got the giant saw blade there. And the returned item is the saw machine, which is a template including the conveyor belt and the saw machine and all that sort of stuff. So one key thing is that I've rephrased this variable to be local has all items. So when it removes that template from our inventory script, it will return either true or false. True if it has managed to find this accepted item within the player's inventory. So it will return true if it managed to do that and remove it. And it will return false if the player never had that inventory or that it can't find that from their inventory. So it will be either true or false. And if it's true, then we can play the sound and spawn our new item. And if it's false, then we don't actually do anything. Although that would be a good place to suggest to the player that what they need to do to actually make this thing work. But I can leave that for you to extend that in the future. So that's what it does at the moment. But what we want it to do is take multiple items. So how do we do that? Well, where we have this accepted item property here, we can actually turn that into an array. Rather than a single item, we can turn it into a group of items all contained within this accepted item property. So after template, we just put, after the quote marks there, we just put comma, space, container equals quote marks array. When I save that script, you might have seen that the accepted item now has a drop-down arrow next to it, and it has one element in it, and that's essentially telling me that this is an array, rather than, for example, in return item, which has one drop-down box here. This one has this drop-down arrow, the number 1, and then a drop-down box here. And I can actually add multiple items now by clicking this plus. So we've got 1, which is the giant saw blade, which is the item that we started with. But we also want to ask the player to pick up the power source. So let's add a power source, which is in my templates library over here. Power source. And the third item was the machine parts. So we can actually drag and drop that in from our template library there. And if I show you what those things look like, the machine parts is this crate. So those crates over there are all machine parts. And the power source is this glowing ore thing, which is over there in that little, almost like a power source ball pit that I have over there. Okay, so now we have 3 items within our accepted item property. So going back to our crafting table, we can see that this is now an array, which means that this is all broken because we're trying to remove template and then we're passing an array of templates rather than just one template. So we can't just assume that that's going to work. We can't just change it from a single item to a group of items and assume it's going to work. We actually have to write that logic ourselves. So the key thing here is we need to check that the player has every item that's listed in our accepted item property. We need to check to have all of them before we remove any of them. Otherwise, if we went through and removed it and got true or false back whether we managed to do that, we might end up removing 2/3 of their inventory, but not actually knowing whether we can make the thing. And then when we find out we can't make the thing, as in has all items is finally false for some reason, then we won't be able to reinstate their inventory. So we need to check their inventory from top to bottom, make sure they have every single item before we do any removing of items. Then once we've done the check and we've checked that they have every item they need to spawn this thing or to create this thing, then we can go ahead and loop through and remove all of those items. So I'm going to need to write a function to check the inventory has all of those accepted items there. And I'm going to do that in the inventory script. So here's what we were using before, the remove template function. So around the same sort of area, I'm going to create a new function. And this one is just going to inventory script, is the name. And this one is going to check whether this inventory has an array, every item within an array of items. So check all items. And we're going to need open bracket there, and we're going to expect the whatever calls this function, whatever piece of code calls this function, to pass us an array of items. So template array. I'm calling it template array because it's quite a good idea to specify the type of thing that we're looking for as the name of the variable. So make it very, very clear. So we're after a template array, and What we'll do is we'll create a Boolean, which is essentially saying, starts with, yep, they've got everything. And if we hit one item in that array, which we don't have in the player inventory, then we'll say, wait, they don't have that one thing, and we'll turn that Boolean to false, and then we'll return that Boolean. So local Boolean has all items, and we're just going to assume true. And then at the end of the function, we will return has all items. So at the moment, this function just returns true. It creates a variable which is equal to true, and then it returns that variable. In between those two lines of code, we're actually going to write a for loop which checks through every item, every template in this template array, and checks that we actually have it. So for I equals 1, comma, hash template array. Do end. You may have seen this before, you may not have, but this is what's called a for loop, and it's a way of iterating. So in this situation, we're creating a variable called I here, and we're saying I starts at 1, and it goes up to however many things there are in our template array. That's what that hash symbol is doing there. It's saying get how many things there are in this template array. And so every line of code from there to there will repeat depending on how many items we have in the array. So the first thing we'll do is we'll say local item equals template array, open square brackets, I close square brackets. So get hold of the item at this position in the array. So to start with, I is 1, so we'll get hold of the item at position 1, which is the giant saw blade. Then when we hit end, I will increase and be 2, and then we'll get hold of the item at position 2, which is the power source. And then at the end, I will go up to 3. We'll get hold of the item at position 3, which is the machine parts, and then end. And then I will go up to 4, but that's greater than how many things there are in our template array. So then it will exit the for loop and continue with the next line of code here. So that's essentially how a for loop works. And so it's a really handy thing to combine with arrays to make sure that you can loop through every item in the array. And it means that we can not necessarily specify in our script exactly how many things. We can instead make a script out, and it makes it more reusable because we could attach it to something which needs 2 things, one other thing which needs 5 things, however many things you want to add. So it's a really nice way of making it extensible, so we can reuse the same script in multiple ways in different places. So we're getting hold of the item at that position in the array. And then we just need to check that that item exists. And fortunately, there's this line of code here which does that already. So I'm going to copy that. Self find item for template. Unfortunately, I've called it the same thing as what I called it. Self find item for template. So I might just change this to template rather than template item. So we're getting hold of whatever template, giant saw blade, power source, or machine parts, storing that in our variable template, or we're storing a reference to that in our variable template. And then we're running this line of code which goes and gets whether the user has that thing in their inventory, and storing, if we have got it, it stores it in this variable here. And then like we do here with this conditional, we're just going to do if item then else end. So if we have an item, then this code will run. If we don't have the item, this code will run. And so this code here is where I need to turn this has all items to false. We found one of the things in the player's inventory, but they don't have it. We found out they don't have this thing. So they don't have all the items. And then we're just returning whether we have or have not got all the items. And so that's essentially the logic behind finding out if we have everything within an array in our player inventory. Now that we've written that function, let's go back to our crafting table script. And instead of this line of code here, which just removes a single item from the player's inventory. We're going to comment that out using the 2 dashes, and we're going to do local has all items equals inventory script, and then we need to call our new function, check all items, and pass the accepted item array, self.properties.accepted item. Now, if they have all of those items that are in that array, true or false will be stored in this has all items local variable. So to get to this point, they have to have had all of the items in that array. Now we'll remove all the items from that array, from their inventory that are in that array. And we're going to do it in a really similar way to the way we did this. So for I equals 1, hash template array do end, except instead of template array, this is self.properties.accepted item. So for 1 to however many things there are in this array, remember that's the same array that we sent to the inventory script, remove that item. So this is we're essentially just going to use this line of code here and pass in self.properties.accepted item at position I. So whatever thing is at position I. So really, really similar to this for loop, except we are removing rather than checking in this one. So we check they have all the items, and then we go ahead and remove all of those items from their inventory. So it might have got a little bit involved there with the scripting, but hopefully that that makes sense. Let's go ahead and test the game. So we need to test this in a couple of different ways. Firstly, we need to see whether just picking up one item, like we had before with the saw blade, let's go and see whether just having that will allow us to create the sawmill. So I've just got my saw blade here. Let's interact. Okay, so that's not working. Now let's go and pick up some machine parts and a power source. These are the now we have the 3 things that we needed to craft this thing. Let's interact here, and there we go. We've got our sawmill. So we need now to pick up those 3 things to create the sawmill. And what would be really fun is to make it so that you have to pick up things to make all the different machines here before the embiggening terminal works, and then you have to use the embiggening terminal to create lots of different size cogs that then hook up to some other thing, and so on and so on. And all of a sudden you've got something resembling a puzzle game, like a crafting puzzle game, but it doesn't need to stop there. You can do lots of different things with this scripting. With this same logic, you can use it to make weapon upgrades or recipes for cakes or ginger beer or whatever you want to do. Hopefully that's been an interesting and useful tutorial. Let me know if you get stuck or want any help by heading over to our Discord and joining the Lua Help channel or the Ask Anything channel. Feel free to @ me. It's a good fun thing to do, and I can't wait to see what you do with it in Crayta.